Hello guys, this is NJ from the MBTI tier lists. And welcome to yet another mother of a tier lists. In today's episode, we're going to be contemplating on the question of what would make for the best ICU nurse out of all of the MBTI personality types. Like an ICU nurse being an intensive care unit nurse. Meaning that like you're the guy in the entire hospital in the whole world who's dealing with the hardest and the most complex medical circumstances, which are also the most critical and the most demanding. Now, before we get into the types, we first have to determine like which functions would be the best for the ICU nurse and to get some kind of an idea about the profession and specialty like itself. Looking at these functions, like they and their relation to the job at hand, and you learn a lot about like being an ICU nurse. Like being an ICU nurse, that is like a really like a different kind like of a nursing specialty. The only other specialty that comes close to the ICU nurse would be like the anesthesia nurse in the operation room. Like basically no other nursing profession comes even close to what the ICU guys are doing. Like maybe in the ER with the most critical patients, you're doing something in those like along those lines. But in reality, the ICU is a world in itself, and like it is completely different from all other professions of nursing. It is also the perfect example of just like there's something for everybody in nursing. At the ICU, like the feeling functions, they don't mean that much because like the patients are in such a bad condition that they can barely communicate with you. Usually they don't, so you don't like really even like interact with the patients. The other thing is that like the patients are in like machines. So in many cases you're not like actually even like treating the patient, you're actually like just like operating the machines. And the patient also has like 10 different monitors where like like an endless quantity of medical data is being like refreshed like every second. So like it is a very like a cerebral nursing specialty. For the feeling functions, it's like, yeah, like, I mean, you are still taking care of a person who's a human being, but like you don't really communicate with the guy. So like when it comes to these like functions that are not necessarily like the best at like, taking care of people like TE or TI, for example, like it doesn't matter that much. Now, of course, like the feeling functions, like I always say, they do give you some like sensitivity to a person's needs. Like even if you were not like talking with the person, or communicating with the guy, just like looking at their bodies and looking at the person, like I like the feeling functions give you some sensitivity, and just like you're just like better at like making a person more comfortable because of the feeling functions. You're better at like taking care of them. But for the most part, like the ICU is a very technical like profession or specialty. Like what you're doing there is like, like you're kind of like you're using your brains, like you're using your brains. You're doing like data analysis. And like yeah, like the place where you actually like need feeling functions for the most in the ICU is with the relatives. So but the relatives, they can visit their mother or father or son or somebody like for only like 15 minutes like every day. So that's kind of like the moment. Of course, like the relatives are super devastated because their father might die, and they probably will, and you have to handle that circumstance emotionally, and so on, and that actually like requires quite a lot of like emotional intelligence. But at the end of the day, that interaction is going to last for 5 to 10 minutes a day, like out of a shift. The other thing is that like at the ICU, you are given like 1 to 2 patients, so like you're basically like focused on this like one guy. So I would say that the introverted functions kind of like it's kind of like an introverted activity where like you're sitting in the same room for like 12 hours straight, like with this one guy that you can't communicate with in any feasible fashion. Like you are observing like 10 monitors, like that give you all kinds of like medical like status report on like blood pressure and respiration rate and pulse and like all manner of medical data is just being refreshed on the screens. Like there might be like 10 different monitors refreshing like 20 different variables in real time, and you have to analyze all of that data. You have to look at that data and think about the ramifications of these numbers in relation to the complexity of the person's like medical conditions, which in the ICU it's rarely like one condition. In most of the cases, like the same guy has like 4 different medical conditions going on at the same time, and it's like you have to understand those like medical bodily mechanics and medical conditions. You have to understand like the concepts and mechanics, and then look at the data and analyze all of those things. There's probably like 1,000 medications, all of their like effects and side effects and joint effects. The ICU, like of all of the nursing specialties, requires the most brains. There is like nothing that comes even close to requiring the level of brains that like an ICU nurse needs to have. Like the learning curve is massive. Like even for intelligent people with good functional stackings, to learn the ICU craft, like it takes years for you to learn how to do that shit. So like I wouldn't rate the feeling functions that high for the ICU nurse, because like for the most part, like you're doing something like with your brains and so on. So what would be the best functions for the brains? I would say that they would probably be, they would probably be like TI, NI, and NE. Like for understanding complex medical mechanics, I like NE is like a little bit better than NI, because you're doing like multiple variable analysis. And NI, it's a bit of a big picture function. So NI is better at like understanding like singular concepts and singular laws and mechanics. NE is better at like looking at like 10 monitors and connecting the dots and so on than NI. Now, that being said, like at the ICU, like you're gonna be sitting down with this one guy for like 12 hours straight. Like at which point, like you're gonna be analyzing the same data that is being updated every second, like for hours on end. So the reason why NE is so powerful, it's because it's the most quick-brained function. But at the ICU, like you don't necessarily have to have like quick brains, because you basically have all the time in the world to contemplate and ruminate and like mull over the matter. So as a matter of fact, like NI at the ICU, in my view, is like pretty much just as powerful as the NE, because NI is one of the most powerful functions for understanding the nature of everything. The other thing that you get from NI is that NI users tend to be more careful. NE is a bit hazardous, and the ICU is the most what they tend to call like the ICU is like you need to have like an obsessive compulsive disorder just to work there. Unlike the ER, the emergency room, where like it's like ADHD, like the ICU is like you need to be meticulous, you need to be careful, you need to be organized, you need to be detail oriented, and you basically can't make any mistakes. Like you're running the trips, like you're doing medications in real time. Like at the ICU, you make a little mistake and the person just fucking dies. Okay, unfortunately for you. So like the NI is simply like a more meticulous and careful function than the NE. Like I would say like TI is like in the middle of the pack. Like they're not like really like TI is not hazardous, but it's not like super tight either. So for brain's functions, I would say that TI and NI would probably be the best brain's functions for like analyzing the data, and they're both also intuitive functions, so they're more okay with just like sitting down in the same place and look at the same data for like 12 hours straight. NE wants to go to places and explore and so on. So I would say like TI and NI would be the best brain's functions. Now then when it comes to like doing a meticulous job and making no mistakes, I mean, like I would say like TE is a good function for that. SI is a good function. I would say like SE is also like SE users. They're not like necessarily like known for being the most meticulous and careful people. But in this kind of a circumstance, like an SE user, if they focus a little bit, they can turn that SE into them just like not making any mistakes and just like running a tight ship and so on. So like these are kind of like the three functions that would make you like make no mistakes, and then TI and NI would be the best functions for you to understand like the medical complexities and so on. So with like TE, you get like a little bit of brains, like I like at the ICU, the medical circumstances get so complex that like TE, like it's a bit too linear, it's a bit too simple-minded. Like you basically have to have like a brain's function, for you to be able to handle the most complex circumstances. Like now TE, that being said, like TE should be able to handle most of the medical circumstances even without like a brain function and so on. So the other thing is that in the ICU, it's one of the rare places for a nurse where like you don't do much with your hands either. So like the guy is in machines, like, and even like starting IVs, like you don't like really start IVs that much in the ICU because the doctor usually does like a central line, where like so like that kind of like replaces the IV. And then there's many times like what they call like an art line, where you can even like get the blood, samples. So like you don't even have to like needle the patients that much as an ICU nurse. Maybe you might be changing a diaper every now and then and doing some like, sometimes you would start like an IV and so on. But like in the ICU, like the patient is there for like 24 hours to 3 days. Like you don't do much like actual caretaking. Of course you do a little bit. Of course you have to like, take care of the hygiene and that kind of stuff. But in the ICU, like the patient is there for a brief time and like you don't do that much like daily, caretaking menial stuff at the ICU. So you don't need nearly as much like hands at the ICU. It is simply a much more technical and like cerebral thing where like you're using your minds and your brains, like you're analyzing the data. The one like kind of like physical thing that you do is like running the trips. Like one guy might be having like 10 different trips. And yeah, that's kind of like a physical thing, but that's not like really like you're not doing anything with your hands, like you're operating machines. And for that purpose, I like TE would probably be the best at like operating a trip machine. Maybe SE and SI would also be good at like, just like making no mistakes with the trip machines and so on. Which is why like I like these functions would probably like be the best, for the job and so on. So yeah, that's pretty much like the ICU, like in a nutshell. And I do think like these functions would be the best. Like I like maybe like SE and SI would just be, A tier. I like these are the like mega super functions, for the ICU. Maybe the SI could be there because it's so careful and so on. Maybe the SC, I don't know. But yeah, that's the ICU. So let's now get into the types and let's start like combining these functions and seeing what's going on. Okay, guys? Okay, guys, so here we have the types. So let's start with the ENFJ and the NFs. Okay, so the ENFJ, like I like the ENFJ in general is like the epitome of the perfect nurse. Like in any other place, the ENFJ is basically S tier, like at the very least, like in most of the places, and so on. Like an ENFJ starts with FE, which is like a super powerful, like a caretaking function and people function and so on. Now the problem is that the ICU, like you simply don't need FE that much. Now, of course, like, yeah, you are taking care of a person and so on, but it's not like really like the guy can't even talk with you. ENFJs would be the best, type in handling the relatives when they come in and their, son is dying and they're crying and they're being devastated and so on. But that's like 5 minutes out of a day, man. So like, I don't want to be a cynical, nihilistical shit. It might sound like a horrible thing to say, but I'm just saying like at the ICU, like you just don't need emotions that much. So like leading with a function that is purely like an emotional function, and that is simply not like the best function for the ICU. Now the secondary, function NI for the ENFJ is actually a super powerful function for the ICU. There's no way around it. Like, so the ENFJ basically has brains. And the tertiary SE gives the ENFJ the capability of like, and the NI-SE combo in the middle, in general, it's like makes the ENFJ maybe like meticulous enough that they can be, the kind of a guy who wouldn't make much mistakes and so on. The ENFJ, they are a bit abstract. They're not like the most careful people, but they're kind of like in the middle of the pack. That they're not like, careless and hazardous like either. So if they would focus a little bit, the ENFJ would probably be careful enough. Now the true problem with the ENFJ lies in the inferior introverted thinking. Now this is like a really problematic thing when it comes to the ICU, because in the ICU, like you're supposed to be able to trust your own logic. And ENFJs, although they have that secondary NI, like when things get like logically too complex, ENFJs can be kind of confused. Like I used to date an ENFJ, I used to live with an ENFJ, she was a bright lady, but when logical complexity got out of hand, the ENFJ would become confused. NI is a big picture function. So for the ENFJ to be looking at this endless quantity of medical data and analyze that shit, like they wouldn't be the greatest like at doing that. I mean, they do have that secondary NI, so they could basically do it. Like I'm not saying that they couldn't do it. And with the NI, they could think about it for hours and so on. But the thing is that at the ICU, like the doctor can't always make it. Okay, there's like one doctor and 10 patients, they're all dying. So like I said, like you need to be able to handle the most complex medical circumstances independently at the ICU. Which means that like you need to be able to trust your fucking logic. And ENFJs sometimes they become a little bit confused with logical complexities. So I know that the ENFJ could be an S tier ICU nurse. Now that being said, that secondary NI, I mean, it is simply such a powerful brains function that I do think like it kind of like carries the ENFJ to the A tier. Either an ENFJ at the end of the day would be an A tier ICU nurse. They would even have some little talent for it because of the NI alone. And that tertiary SE would just give them, the capability of like, running the trips and not making any mistakes and so on. And once again, the ENFJs would be the greatest in dealing with the relatives and so on. So I like an ENFJ would be an A tier ICU nurse. So what about the ENFP? So the ENFP leads with NE. So like ENFPs actually have like way more like brains than ENFJs. ENFPs would not become as confused as the ENFJs with complex logical stuff. The problem with the ENFP is that they have like a tertiary TE, which means that they actually have like a polar TI. Like meaning that they like are completely oblivious to the logical complexities of the TI as well. So they kind of like share something in common with the ENFJs there. Now that being said, the NE, in my view, it's a much more better compensational function for the lack of TI than NI, because NE understands complexity. Like I would say better than NI. And ENFPs are also leading with NE, like they're leading with an intuitive function. So it's like so much more stronger than the secondary NI of the ENFJ anyways. Coupled with that TE, which gives the ENFP some pretty feasible like executional capability in like ENFPs, they're some of the most hazardous types. But that tertiary TE would probably give them the capability of like running the trips like in a relatively feasible manner, like still, and like not making any mistakes. The ENFP would like really have to focus, like even more than the ENFJs. ENFJs are more careful and meticulous by nature than the ENFP. ENFP is one of the most hazardous types in the system. ENFPs would like really have to focus their minds, if they wanted to work in the ICU, to not make any little like careless mistakes and so on. But given the fact that the ENFPs like do have such insane brains with the NE alone, I would rate the ENFP above the ENFJ basically. And ENFPs with the secondary FI, once again, they would be really talented with the relatives and so on. And just like, observing the patient and then taking care of them and so on. ENFPs definitely have that like, FI sensitivity to go with. But I was like an ENFP with like an A tier ICU nurse. So what about the INFJ? INFJ leads with NI, which is one of the best brain functions for the ICU. Once again, and INFJs tend to be super careful, meticulous, and they tend to like blame themselves so much and be so afraid of making a mistake that they brute force themselves to not make a mistake. Secondary FE, like you wouldn't do that much with it, but it would give the INFJ that like caretaking sensitivity and good with the relatives and so on. The tertiary TI, like INFJs have insane brains. The NI-TI combo is one of the strongest combos in understanding like medical concepts and mechanics and so on. Like unlike with the ENFJ, who might struggle a little bit with the most complex logical circumstances, the INFJ would not. The tertiary TI enables the INFJ's NI to understand like even the most complex logical medical circumstances. So INFJs would definitely have the brains for dealing with even the most complex medical circumstances, as long as they were trained and like got the experience on the job, just like everybody would require experience on the ICU and to be trained and so on. So INFJs, they can trust their logic. The NI-TI combo is a super robust combo in trusting one's logic and so on. So I think the INFJ would do better than the ENFJ. The problem with the INFJ is that they have an inferior extrovert sensing, and a polar TE. So the INFJ's like executional capabilities are actually quite low. That being said, the INFJs, despite not having much executional capability, I mean, they tend to be careful people because of that like main NI like anyways. And the thing about like the ICU is that like you're operating trips, like you're operating machinery. And that's like, you don't need that much like hands. Like you're not like executing like physical stuff per se. Like you're operating machinery. So I like it's a little bit easier to execute stuff when it comes to like operating a machine. Compared to like executing some like physical stuff. So like I actually think that the ICU would be pretty like an ideal place for the INFJ in many ways. Like in some ways their weakness with physical reality like wouldn't like really be that much of a problem at the ICU, because it's more like a logical thing. Like even the mechanical and technical stuff, like like are traced back to your logical capabilities, which the INFJ would have in spades. I actually think the INFJ would be an S tier ICU nurse. Like sitting down with the patient for 12 hours straight and like letting your NI just like contemplate on the medical variables and the INFJ, which is like the NI becomes more powerful the more that they have time to think about something. And in the ICU, you have a time to think about it for hours. So the INFJ would just figure it out and they would be able to tweak the trips and everything perfectly and they would just have the brains for it, and they would be careful enough. So actually that like INFJs would be an S tier ICU nurse. What about the INFP? So the INFP, like has many similar problems as the ENFP, and in some ways the ENFJ. I don't like INFPs, they lead with FI, so they're like some of the most sensitive people to like being a caretaker. Like the FI-SI combo is super powerful for taking care of people and making them comfortable and so on. But unfortunately, once again, the main FI function like just like wouldn't be that useful for the like ICU. Like your biggest strength is not that meaningful for the environment of ICU. Now the secondary NE, I do believe that the secondary NE is a better brains function for the ICU than the secondary NI. I don't think like INFPs become as confused by like mechanical, logical, medical complexities as an ENFJ would. Now the problem with the INFP is kind of like the similar one with the ENFP, that INFPs tend to be really hazardous. INFPs, they do have that tertiary SI, so unlike INFPs who would like really like focus, they could actually be maybe careful enough to not like kill anybody at the ICU. I mean, hopefully. They are introverts, so INFP sitting next to a guy for 12 hours straight, analyzing the same variables with their NE and letting it wander. The fuck? Okay, so like some fucking like maintenance guy came over all of a sudden. Like I got startled. But anyways, like the INFP. Yeah, so like the INFP, like I like INFPs do have like more brains than the ENFJ, and like INFPs like sitting in a room for 12 hours straight, like analyzing the same data over and over again with your NE and so on. Like I like INFPs. They're introverts, so they could probably like do something like that. That they like ENFJs and ENFPs, they want to go out there, meet people, and do stuff, and so INFPs would be more okay with just like sitting there by themselves, like with a patient that doesn't even like interact with you. I like an INFP at the end of the day would be better than the ENFJ, like more suited for the ICU. INFPs would even have like talent for that shit. Because of the NE basically. with their brains and so on. I also that there's something like about being like a main FI user that like you're like really good at like sitting down with a guy that you can't even communicate with. You know, the INFPs they have that like next level compassion that, you know, INFPs would just like feel super deep compassion and be super like sensitive to even like the smallest fluctuations like in the person, even without like looking at the monitors or anything, simply because they're so unimaginably like compassionate that the FI-SI combo makes it like hypersensitive to people and so on. So I like INFPs would make for a feasible ICU nurse. And once again, you don't do that much with your hands. It's so much more abstract. So INFPs are abstract. They have the brains for it. You know, I like an ICU nursing would be more suitable for the INFP than like your normal like MedSurg nursing and so on. Simply because at the ICU, like once again, it is more abstract and you are like a more abstract person and so on. So what about the NTs? What about the ENTJ? So the ENTJ leading with TE, you know, which is one of the best functions for the ICU. Like ENTJs would be some of the most talented people in like running the trips and making no mistakes whatsoever over the course of 12 hours when you're like doing stuff in real time, like you're analyzing the data, you know, you're running the trips, you're like doing medications based on the circumstance that you see on the monitors. You know, ENTJs, they have a secondary NI, and like I always say, you know, compared to the ENFJs, like ENTJs derive way more out of their NIs when it comes to like scientific like questions than the ENFJ, because like, you know, ENTJs lead with TE, so it kind of like, you know, focuses their NI into technical, logical, and mechanical stuff. And TE can actually like figure out like most of the medical stuff by itself. So the NI then just becomes this super powerful, supportive brains function for the TE, which makes the ENTJs some of the biggest brainiacs in the system. Like of course not as great as the other NTs, but still up there. ENTJs are at the end of the day like NTs. And so on. Now the great thing for the ENTJ about the ICU is that like, you know, you wouldn't need as much emotions and emotional intelligence and so on, so that like inferior FI that usually takes down the ENTJ in being a nurse, like wouldn't be that impactful, like at the ICU. Like you're basically doing a logical, technical stuff the whole day, you know, and you don't even have to communicate with the patient that much. Like, yeah, you have to handle the relatives and so on, but like I like ENTJs tend to be like sociable enough, and they have enough social skills that I think they could get they would be able to get a pass on those circumstances for like the 5 minutes you're talking with the devastated relatives. Like I don't want to be a nihilist and like downplay the horrible feelings of the people whose son is about to die. But that's like, you know, the ICU, I mean, it's a brutal place, man. Like people are dying and they're in the worst imaginable condition, you know, and that's what it is. I actually think that the ENTJ would be a super like talented ICU nurse. Like basically all of their weaknesses like are not that meaningful. Like as an ND, like you get to like, you know, spend your whole day like basically doing like medical data analysis and operating machinery in real time, like based on the like, you know, logical analysis that you're doing at the same time. You know, like understanding medical concepts and understanding the ramifications of all of the like, you know, different values and you know, blood tests and so on. I like an ENTJ would be an S tier ICU nurse. Yeah, the ENTJ might not be the best caretaker in the world. I'm not sure if they would be at the top of the S tier or anything. Because of that, I do think like having caretaking instincts is still important at the ICU, but I do think like just like the data analysis and operating the machines and making no mistakes while doing it. I mean, that's the most important thing, because like if you fail at this basic task, which is super complex, like people are gonna die. And the ENTJ, they're so competent, they're so intelligent that I like an ENTJ would basically be nailing the ICU job. You know, I would actually say that if you want to be a nurse as an ENTJ, like the ICU would basically be the place that I would recommend for you, like among a few others, you know. But I like ENTJs would be way more suitable for the ICU than, for example, MedSurg, where like you have to be more of a caretaker, you know. Like you do a lot of like menial caretaking stuff, you know, and so on. In the ICU, the patient barely notices you because there is such a bad condition. And it's a technical, logical thing to do. So I like the ENTJ would be an S tier ICU nurse. So what about the ENTP? So I would say the ENTPs, once again, like very similar to the ENFP. NE gives you all the brains in the world, but ENTPs, you know, they got that double brain going on. Like they got like a secondary introverted thinking to go with the NE. Like ENTPs are some of the smartest people in the system. They have some of the greatest, you know, logical analysis like of anybody. You know, ENTPs were born to solve logical problems. They have super quick brains. They understand concepts and mechanics. You know, like especially the more abstract that they are, the better. ENTPs have the same problem as the ENFPs, that they are a bit hazardous. Now, the thing about the ICU is that like you're doing like data analysis and you're operating machinery. You're operating the drips and so on. It's like a much more logical thing to be careful about. So once again, I didn't like, you know, for an intuitive, it's easier to be careful about something that is a little bit abstract. And ENTPs, like, and like trusting your logic would be really important at the ICU. ENTPs trust the fuck out of their logic because it is so sound. You know, so I like for ENTPs, they're usually really hazardous, but in the ICU, it's a weird thing. I think that it would be easier for the ENTP to be careful in the ICU than in MedSurg, for example. You have to do stuff with your hands. At the ICU, like, you don't do anything with your hands. So like you basically like have to be careful with your logic. And yeah, like you have to be super careful with the trip machines and so on. You know, yeah, of course, ENTPs, they are a little bit hazardous, even with that kind of stuff. But I like ENTPs with that like mega brains. Like even ENFPs do have at the end of the day like a polar TI. ENFPs can be slightly confused by complex logic every now and then. ENTPs do not become confused by shits. You know, ENTPs trust their logic, their analysis is spot on. You know, you're dealing with mechanical, logical stuff. So, you know, I like an ENTP would actually be at the S tier as an ICU nurse. Like once again, I wouldn't hold them in the higher ranks of the S tier simply because they are at the end of the day hazardous. But I like if an ENTP would put in the effort, which they would have to, in being more careful and meticulous. I mean, they simply have like the brains that are so strong that like they would just figure it out and they would do it really fast. And you just like have to give the S tier to the ENTP because of the brains alone. ENTPs would also be really good at with the relatives and so on because of their tertiary FE and would have like a little bit more sensitivity for the patient over the ENTJ and so on, which is like why it's hard to determine like who would be better. Maybe the ENTP, because they do have that compassionate, like, you know, sensitivity to people, would just be like a little bit better than the ENTJ. And complex variable analysis, they would be a little bit better at that than the ENTJ as well, you know. So yeah, I like the ENTP with an S tier ICU nurse. What about the INTJ? INTJs leading with NI, just like the INFJ. You know, TE secondary, INTJs are even more careful and meticulous than the INFJ. You know, the NI, like TE combo once again gives you insane brains. Like the INTJ leads with NI. So like INTJs have some of the strongest brains in the entire system. And INTJs like sitting in a room for 12 hours, just look at the same monitors and analyzing the same data that keeps on fluctuating a little bit. And just like letting that introverted intuition like contemplate on the medical concepts in play. Like the INTJ, man, like they would be the top of the S tier, like as an ICU nurse. Like the INTJ's minds would just like in the course of hours, they would be look at the patient, look at the monitors, thinking about the whole circumstance. The INTJ's brains would just like realize the nature of everything. And by the time that like some shit would start going down with the patient, like they would have come up with like a contingency plan for every imaginable like outcome and prepared for all of their ramifications. And INTJ would not only like come to have revelations about the circumstance in question, they would have at the same time as a side effect come to realize the nature of all medical science and probably write a book about it. And you know, and so on. So INTJs, and they have that secondary TE. So an INTJ does not make any mistakes. They are control freaks. You know, INTJs are the best people. It's like sitting in a room and having everything under control and understanding the deeper ramifications of every single imaginable action that they could take, and understanding the meaning of every single little variable in relation to the medical condition and concepts. I like INTJs would make for S tier ICU nurses. I like this is like literally the fields that would fit the INTJ the best. As a nurse, you know, I like INTJs would be grumpy as fuck as like MedSurg nurses, you know, and your usual nurse. But the ICU is basically the domain of the INTJ, where they truly get to be the masterminds of super complex operations, and where their like capacity for insight and revelation, which like get to shine, you know, for the benefit of the patient. At the tertiary FI would give them a little bit of sensitivity for the patient as well, you know, and let them be relatively okay with the relatives and so on. So I like an INTJ would not only be like an S tier ICU nurse, they would be at the top of the S tier hands down. So what about the INTP? So INTP, once again, TINE, the same combo as the ENTP. You know, it is some of the most, like, I mean, it is the most powerful, like, complex data analysis, you know, function combos in existence. The tertiary SI makes the INTP more careful than the ENTP. So the INTP would also have, like, the brains for days for the ICU nurse. I actually think that the INTP would have just as much brains as the INTJ or the INFJ or the NTP for doing the medical analysis. Now, in the case of the INTP, I mean, like, this is like the one type that I always say that, like, you're having inferior FE. INTPs are the closest to having Asperger's in the entire system. Based on their type, INTPs are so unimaginably out of it with people that I like in the case of an INTP, it would actually start like affecting like their way in the ICU. There's no way around it, you know, like there is like a little bit of a caretaking aspect still going on. And you know, you do have to talk with the relatives, and INTPs would be arguably the worst type in the entire system to actually talk with the relatives and deal with the crying kids whose mother is just died in the hands of the INTP because they couldn't do anything about it, because sometimes you can't. So I have to say that, like, I know the INTP would be like an unimaginably talented person for the ICU because of their insane brains. You know, they would be meticulous in running the trips, and they would understand the medical complexity and like INTPs would actually like being in the ICU. They would not have to interact with the patient that much and so on. So like the ICU would be one of the best places for the INTP. You know, I think an INTP would be better than an INFP, better than even an ENFP in the ICU. And I like the INTP is a perfect example, like in the ICU, of how like nursing, you know, has a specialty for everybody. Like the ICU would be close to the best specialty for the INTP, like as a nurse. So if you really want to be a nurse and an INTP, don't worry about it. Like, you know, there is a place for you in nursing, that is the ICU, like among like basically one other, you know, specialty. So, but would they be like S tier? That is like the only question. Like, you know, how much like caretaking does it require? How much do you have to deal with the relatives? You know, like the S tier like guys are basically perfect for the job. Like, would the INTP be like perfect? Like, you're still taking care of people. You do have to touch them. You know, sometimes you do communicate with the patients. You know, and the other thing is like, even if they're in a really bad condition, they do communicate sometimes with their like eye movements and that kind of stuff. And you know, how well would the INTP be able to be be reading such like super nuanced and subtle, you know, communication? I think that they would be basically the worst at it. So like you just like I'm so sorry, but like the INTP they just kind of like can't go to the S tier. I like an INTP would be like an A tier ICU nurse. So what about the SFs? Okay. What about the ISFJ? The ISFJ, leading with SI, means that they make no mistakes. They're the most meticulous and careful people. They're the greatest caretakers in history. Secondary FE, you wouldn't need it that much. Tertiary TI, they kind of have the brains, but having a brains function as your tertiary function for something that it's like, you know, 90% of your job is using your brains, that it starts getting to a point where, like, you know, all of these intuitive guys, they got like a brains function minimum as a secondary function. You know, the tertiary TI, like, I'm not really sure if it would be enough, you know, to get the ISFJ to the A tier. Like on the A tier, like, you got some talent for this shit. Like, all of these guys have brains for that shit. The ISFJ, you know, I like the ISFJ is like S tier as a nurse in like 90% of the nursing specialties. But, you know, I think the ICU might be one of the rare places where the ISFJ is just like not that like necessarily like talented. You know, I think like ISFJs would be good at like running the trips and making no mistakes and so on. I know that they would be bad at it, like in the whole thing. That SI-TI combo, it is a powerful combo in figuring out like medical mechanics and so on. But it's almost like it's kind of like barely enough. You know, I like the ISFJ would be the kind of a person who would get the job done. And I like ISFJs could understand even like the, you know, intensivist doctors, you know, analysis about the matter with their TI and so on. But could the ISFJ like really compete with like intuitives when it comes to like logical medical analysis? Like I really hate to say this, but like I don't think so. Like ISFJs have an inferior extroverted intuition and only like a tertiary TI function to go with the brains. And the other thing is like they're like a main sensor. Like, you don't do that much with your hands in the ICU. It's a bit of an abstract, you know, thing that you're doing at the ICU. So I like the ISFJ would be like a little bit out of the waters, you know, like it wouldn't be like their forte, so to speak. Now that being said, that the SI-TI combo is still like powerful enough that I think the ISFJ could figure it out for the most part and get the job done with proper training and so on. So I like an ISFJ at the ICU would be like a B tier guy, which is like the kind of a guy who gets the job done a feasible worker among others, but not like super mega talented or anything, but just like a feasible guy who would get the job done. Okay, so what about the ESFP? So the ESFP leading with SE, secondary FI, like you don't need that as much, you know. Tertiary TE, like you don't have the brains, man. Like the ESFP's brains function is NI and it's their inferior function. Now TE, it's a bit too simple-minded as a function, and as a tertiary function, it's just like I'm sorry to say, but it basically doesn't give you enough brains for the ICU. Like I'm sure that like if you had like a high IQ as an ESFP, like you could still get the job done and work in the ICU. But we're getting to a place where like the ESFP, starting with SE, they want to go to places, meet people. You know, in the ICU, like you would be stuck in a room for 12 hours straight, like staring at the same monitors and doing like data analysis. Now the ESFPs would be really talented in like running the trips and like not make any mistakes and so on. They would be good with the relatives and so on. But the data analysis portion of the job, just like I mean, it would like escape the mind of the ESFP. You know, like unfortunately, it wouldn't be their forte. ESFPs have like a polar TI function as well, which means that like they can also get kind of confused with like, you know, complex logical circumstances. ESFPs make for some of the great nurses overall, but I would have to say like the ICU simply wouldn't be the best place for the ESFP because of the lack of an actual brains function and the abstract quality of the job. ESFPs, they're also once again main sensors, and the ICU is a bit of, you're getting to the abstract side of things with the ICU stuff. So yeah, I would say that the ESFP would be a C tier ICU nurse. So what about the ISFP? I like ISFPs would be better at sitting down with a guy for 12 hours straight, and ISFPs, they do have like a tertiary NI. So it's like, you know, they could kind of like let it like ruminate and mull and just like contemplate on the medical mechanics and you know, the medical concepts and the conditions and so on. Like I like an ISFP might have more brains for the, you know, ICU than the ESFP. I would probably rate the ISFP higher than the ESFP. But NI as your tertiary function, it's super single-minded. You know, ISFPs have like a polar NE. I'm not sure if like ISFPs are the best at like understanding the complexities of everything. Like, you know, NI is a big picture function, and the more it goes down in your functional stacking, the more kind of like single-minded it becomes. Like I would be tempted to get the ISFP to the B tier with the ISFJ, but I do it like maybe as a tertiary function, NI would be a worse brains function than TI, you know, because TI still understands like logical complexity. Like even as a tertiary function, you know, as a main function, I like for the INFJ, for example, or even as a secondary function for the like ENFJ, I know that the NI can, like if you let it think about it enough, like can kind of figure out like complexities. But as a tertiary function, I mean, of course, like some ISFPs have really strong NIs. You know, some ISFPs basically have like a stronger FI than SE. The SE would enable them to run the trips like a maniac, like a pro. Okay, like I'm tempted to put the ISFP to the B tier. I like an ISFP could still get the job done. You know, that tertiary NI, and because you have the time to think about it. Usually, like, you know, you're walking into a room and you're like thinking about the same circumstance for like 12 hours straight. Midway through, something goes to shit, and then you start to have to operate. I like an ISFP with a high IQ could like still get the job done. and it's like be a feasible worker, like among others. Like I would like to believe that. Okay. So what about the ESFJ? ESFJs, starting with FE, once again, you don't need that as much. SI, yeah, they can be careful, but you don't do anything with your hands. ESFJs are kind of like good with their hands. Tertiary NE as a brains function. Inferior TI. You know, ESFJs, of all of the people in the system, are basically the worst with logic. You know, and they are not introverts. Once again, like being an introvert gives you so much for the ICU. The ISFP is they live in their own inner worlds. They can spend hours and hours contemplating on stuff. ESFJs, they're like really like reactionary people. They're living in the real worlds. They're, you know, paying attention to outside worlds, you know, and so on. Like I hate to say this, I did like ESFJs kind of like wouldn't have like the brains for the ICU. Like I don't want to be an asshole, but I just have to say that. You know, ESFJs, they struggle with logic. They can't trust their own logic, and that like inferior TI simply makes the ESFJs kind of like some of the worst like data analysts in the entire system. Okay, I mean, of course, they would be the greatest in the caretaking aspect and talking with the relatives and so on, but the actual like data analysis nature of the ICU, like I hate to say this, but like ESFJs would probably be the only type where I would say that like I'm not sure if I would recommend becoming an ICU nurse for the ESFJ. I mean, ESFPs could still get the job done. I like ESFJs would like really struggle. There's so much logic, so much complexity, you know. Yeah, like I'm sorry to say, but I like an ESFJ would be like a D tier ICU nurse, and this is like the one, maybe the one, you know, nursing specialty that I wouldn't recommend for the ESFJ. Like if an ESFJ would come to me and be like, hey, I'm planning on becoming an ICU nurse, I would be like, are you sure, man? Like, and I would recommend something else for you, basically. That's what I'm gonna say. Okay, so what about the ISTs? What about the ISTJ? Leading with SI, secondary TE, ISTJs are some of the most meticulous people. I mean, they are the most meticulous type in the system. You know, TE as your secondary function gives you like more brains than as your tertiary function, and SI main for the ISTJs. Like I always say that like ISTJs have a weird, like they don't have a brains function. Like ISTJs brains function is extroverted intuition and it's their like inferior function. But ISTJs, they are such like ardent students and scholars that like ISTJs learn everything, they memorize everything. And you know, so ISTJs have memorized all of the medical concepts, all of the mechanics, all of the medications, all of the side effects and everything. Like ISTJs are like walking Wikipedias. So ISTJs is the one type in the system that like doesn't have a brains function that still has like the brains. There's no way around it. ISTJs know, so like when they get into something, they learn and memorize so much that they like end up like as a side effect like end up having the brains basically. ISTJs would be the best at running the trips, sitting in a room for 12 hours straight, like, you know, analyzing and managing the same medical circumstance over and over again. And yeah, like ISTJs are not, you know, abstract people, but they memorize so much data that it's almost like they have like a weird way of being abstract themselves without being abstract. It's like they remember all of the concepts in a very literal manner and like do the SITE on that shit. So I actually think like ISTPs would be like really talented ICU nurses. You know, yeah, maybe it's like a little bit too abstract and so on, but I don't know, man. Like I like the ISTJ would be an S tier ICU nurse. There's nowhere around it. Um, um, they are good caretakers. You know, they could talk with the relatives as well with the tertiary FI. That they're so meticulous. They understand the medical concepts and mechanics and everything. Like I have to say, I like the ISTJ would just be like one of the best ICU nurses. Like sitting in a room analyzing data. ISTJs, they simply are the one type that has the brains without having a brains function. That's what it is. So I like that ISTJ would be like basically like an S tier, like at the top of the S tier as an ICU nurse. There's no way around it, okay? Yeah. So what about the ISTP? I like the ISTP, I mean, they have the brains, they have the technical, logical brains. Like ISTPs were born to be engineers. This is data analysis. Yeah, they are the action man. Yeah, they are really good with their hands. Yeah, like you don't do much with your hands in the ICU. But doing logical data analysis is simply the forte of the ISTP and running the trips based on your logic and doing logical decision making on what kind of like milligrams you're supposed to like inject as a medication and what kind of medication. All of these things, there are medical science questions. And the ISTPs are just like the greatest in understanding medical science or any field of science for that matter. Now, the ISFTPs, they do have that inferior extroverted feeling. It's like the INTP, like akin to the ENTJ, who has like an inferior introverted feeling. So ISTPs, they have low emotional intelligence. They do have some social skills, like the SE does give the ISTPs some social skills. And once again, like this is the one specialty, out of like it's like one other where like, the emotional stuff doesn't mean that much. I like the ISTP and the ICU would get away with a lot with their inferior FE. It's like wouldn't be that important. They are like a little bit better with people than INTPs. ISTPs are not Asperger. They just don't understand the complexities of human existence. But ISTPs, they're like, relaxed. They're humble. They're introverted. ISTPs usually get along with people. And they do live in the real world. INTPs are heads in their clouds and they don't understand people. That's like a really poor combination. ISTPs are grounded in reality. So I think the ISTPs like social skills and lack of emotional intelligence, it's like wouldn't be that much of a big deal. I think it would be like the same thing with the ENTJ, that they have enough social skills to get away with it at the ICU. I think that the ISTP would be an S tier ICU nurse. I think they would be even better than the ENTJ. Sitting in a room, they're introvert sitting in a room, 12 hours straight, like analyzing the same logical, data and operating the trips. Like this, like literally what an ISTP was born to do. Yeah, once again, they wouldn't be the best caretakers and so on, but the ICU, like I think the ISTP could be like forgiven enough for them to actually just be S tier anyways. TISE combo, super powerful for analyzing science. The tertiary NI, which is like, and you would like really get to go deep with that NI as an ISTP over the course of like 12 hours, So INTJs, ISTPs, they would let that like NI just like go, man. Like just go into a deep water and just contemplate the whole time and do the TI analysis and everything. And it's like, yeah, I think the ISTP would be an S tier ICU nurse. So what about the ESTP? ESTPs have tertiary FE, so they're better with the relatives and better as caretakers. That SETI combo, I mean, like the secondary TI, is ample amount of brains for you to do the medical, logical analysis. There's no way around it. ESTPs would be having the brains. The SE main function would make them careful enough, would get them to execute the trips without making any mistakes when they focus to do that. So ESTPs would have the brains and the technical and logical capability. And they also wouldn't have that people weakness or caretaking weakness basically at all. The problem, so the ESTP would definitely be above the INTPs. The problem with the ESTP is that they are some of the most outgoing types. SE main, they want to go to places, be action men and do stuff and so on. Like sitting in a room for 12 hours would be the very antithesis of an ESTP. I don't think they would fit the ESTP because of how introverted the activity is. And that being said, I do think that an ESTP would be an S tier ICU nurse. It wouldn't be their style, but if they would force themselves to do it like from the perspective of competence, they would get the job done, and they would be actually some of the most talented ICU nurses because they do have the brains for that shit, and they don't make any mistakes. They could totally handle the trips. So in the case of an ESTP, it wouldn't be a question of if they can do it. They would be nailing it if they would bother do it. It would be a question of if they would want to work in a place that would be so introverted and where you can't go anywhere. So competence-wise, I think ESTPs would make for some of the greatest ICU nurses out there. Hands down, no way around it. And with that 30 FE, they would still have some caretaking instincts as well. So yeah, you might even rate them above the ENTP. There's no way around it. They would be the greatest. So what about the ESTJ? So the ESTJ, leading with TE, really good for running the trips and so on. Secondary SI, they're super powerful. They also, ESTJs, also they pay attention to details. They're good at remembering concepts literally, in a literal fashion, just like ISTJs. So ESTJs would be some of the most competent people in running the trips and making no mistakes. TE as your main function gives you more brains out of the TE than as a tertiary function, for example. Now that being said, ESTJs, they do have that tertiary NE, which would kind of give them a little bit more brains, The TE-NE combo is feasible. I like the ESTJs would be at the point where it's would they have enough brains for the job? And ESTJs would be probably the person who would just have barely enough brains to deal even with the most complex of circumstances. The most complex circumstance for the ESTJs, they would probably struggle a little bit. They might get a headache. Trying to figure out complex logical mechanics with TE, it's not that practical. But as a main TE user, you could just crunch the living fuck out of your TE and brute force it to go through every single mechanic one by one and figure it out anyways. The inferior FI wouldn't be that big of a deal. ESTJs have arguably even better social skills than ENTJs. ESTJs do get along with people. I like ESTJs would be better at handling the relatives than the ENTJ. ESTJs would be a little bit better caretakers than the ENTJ. ESTJs do have that secondary SI, so they can pay attention to specific physical needs better than the ENTJs. But the ENTJs wouldn't have as much brains. It's a really brains requiring activity. I definitely think that the ESTJ would be at the S tier. Their main weakness with people wouldn't be as pronounced in the ICU. They would be the best running the trips and making no mistakes. Would they be better than the ENTJ? I don't know. They probably would be at the bottom of the S tier simply because of all of these people in the S tier, the ESTJs would have the smallest brains. but we're still talking about the S tier. I mean, all of these S tier guys are super talented, and the ESTJ would be definitely like have a talent for being an ICU nurse. Like even these like A tier people would have the talent. Like ESTJs would be at the top of the grade. I just don't think they would be necessarily be able to compete with the rest of the S tier. But yeah, like a purely technical task, logical analysis. ESTJs, maybe they are a little bit more grounded in reality. They don't like abstract stuff as much. ESTPs and ISTPs do much more because TI is an abstract function. ESTJs are the construction worker guy. Like sitting in a room for 12 hours straight, like just look at the monitors, like wouldn't be the forte of the ESTJ, but man, would they nail that shit. I think they would be some of the most proficient ICU nurses out there. Okay, so I do that they deserve the S tier in this case. And here we have it. The ultimate tier list for the ICU nurse. Like I'm really happy that I got to make this video because once again it's like like we're talking about like nurses here. And look at these guys, ESTJ, INTJ, ENTJ at the S tier, like ISTP as an S tier nurse. How can that be? So this is like a good example of like, become a nurse, man. Like there's something for everybody, Yeah, like I'm really like happy that like nursing is such a broad, profession. I'm planning on becoming a nurse myself. And like it's a treasure chest of opportunities. There is something for everybody. So if you're planning on becoming a nurse, don't worry about it. You have your own specialty there. Even if you were like an INTP, you can be a nurse because there's something for you out there. And I have made other videos about this, and I'm gonna be making more videos about the nursing specialties, looking at what types are the best for it and so on. So if you're interested in becoming a nurse, check out those videos, and you will learn something about nursing specialties and which type would be the best for everything and so on. And so like guys, thank you and see you in the next video. Okay.